What if the Byzantine Empire never fell? The screen fades to black. Then, a sudden burst of light reveals the golden dome of Hagia Sophia under a stormy sky. Thunder rolls. The sound of distant horns echoes through narrow marble streets. Soldiers in purple cloaks march through the gates of Constantinople, their shields glinting with the double-headed eagle. The city is alive, trembling with both splendor and dread. History tells us that one May morning in 1453, the walls finally crumbled, and the empire that had once been Rome's eastern half disappeared into legend. But imagine if those walls had held. Imagine if the Byzantine Empire had never fallen. What would our world look like? And how would history itself have been rewritten? In the dying light of the Middle Ages, a city still gleamed on the edge of Europe and Asia, shimmering like a jewel on the Bosphorus. Constantinople. For 1,000 years, its domes had caught the first rays of dawn, its walls had cast shadows over empires, and its name had struck awe and fear in equal measure. But by the 15th century, the jewel was cracked. The Byzantine Empire, once the proud continuation of Rome, stretched no farther than the horizon seen from its walls. It was a realm reduced to memory, clinging to survival as tides of conquest surged on every side. The city itself remained formidable, guarded by the legendary Theodosian walls, triple lines of stone and mortar that for centuries had turned aside Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, even Crusaders. Behind those ramparts lay Hagia Sophia, the vast church whose dome seemed to hover as if suspended by heaven itself, where candles flickered on golden mosaics depicting emperors and saints. Yet these same walls now enclosed little more than a weary remnant. Where once 500,000 souls crowded the avenues, only about 50,000 remained. Empty forums echoed with silence. Markets once overflowing with merchants from Venice, Alexandria, and Trebizond were now thin, the hum of commerce replaced by anxious whispers. The emperor, Constantine Palaiologos, bore the weight of centuries on his shoulders. He was no Augustus, commanding legions across continents, nor a Justinian, raising monuments to eternity. He was the last in a line, the final defender of a flame that had burned since the Caesars. His realm was scarcely more than the city itself, and yet he carried the title of Basileus of the Romans. That title mattered, because as long as Constantinople endured, Rome was not dead. But across the straits, in the hills of Anatolia, a storm was gathering. Mehmed II, the Ottoman Sultan, was just 21 years old, but already burned with vision. His predecessors had encircled the empire piece by piece, but Mehmed intended more. He sought not merely to take the city, but to crown it as the capital of a new Rome, one reborn under the crescent. Constantinople was not only a fortress to him, it was destiny. By the spring of 1453, Mehmed assembled an army the likes of which Byzantium had not seen in generations. Some say 80,000 men, janissaries drilled with iron discipline, cavalry swift as the wind, auxiliaries from across his realm, and above all, the terrifying engines of the new age, cannons. Among them, a monstrous bombard forged by Hungarian craftsmen, capable of hurling stone balls the size of oxen. Each shot could shake the earth itself. Inside the city, perhaps 7,000 defenders stood ready. Greeks, Italians, mercenaries, priests, and even common citizens prepared to hold the line. They prayed in Hagia Sophia, the dome resounding with chants, as if the very stones begged for divine mercy. Priests led processions through the streets, lifting icons of the Virgin, invoking protection. Constantine himself walked the walls, speaking to soldiers, promising that their fight was not only for the empire, but for Christendom itself. And yet, help from Christendom was sparse. The kings of Europe, weary from their own wars, sent only token support. Venice and Genoa, calculating as ever, offered a few ships and men, but guarded their own trade interests more closely than their allies' survival. The Pope in Rome called for unity, but his words carried little weight among princes who feared each other more than the Turk. Thus, the empire that had once commanded the Mediterranean now stood almost alone. The siege began with thunder. Cannons roared, shaking the walls of Theodosius, throwing stone and dust high into the air. Each impact was like a drumbeat of doom, hammering at the resolve of the defenders. But the walls held, for now. At night, the Byzantines worked feverishly, filling breaches with rubble, shoring up towers, praying by torchlight. By day, arrows darkened the sky. Smoke curled from burning suburbs, and the cries of battle echoed across the water. For nearly 2 months, the clash raged. From the heights of Galata across the Golden Horn, European merchants watched in uneasy silence, their own fates bound to the outcome. Within the walls, fear mixed with defiance. Mothers taught their children hymns as if each song might be their last. Soldiers sharpened rusting blades, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. And always the shadow of Mehmed loomed, relentless, patient, certain that time was on his side. The world itself seemed to pause, for here, in the city of marble and mosaic, stood the last remnant of the Roman dream. If Constantinople could endure, perhaps the light of the ancient world might yet survive into a new dawn. If it fell, the Middle Ages would truly end, and a new age, an Ottoman age, would begin. And so, as May approached, both sides braced for the storm's climax. The city still stood, but its foundations trembled. On the horizon, destiny sharpened its blade. Dawn broke over the Bosphorus, with a haze of smoke drifting low across the waters. From the decks of Venetian ships anchored in the Golden Horn, sailors could see the Ottoman camps stretched like an iron ring around the city. Thousands of tents, their fabrics dyed in crimson and green, rippled in the morning wind. Drums pounded steadily, as if the earth itself had been harnessed to the rhythm of war. For the people of Constantinople, every sunrise brought the same question. Would this be their last? The city had endured sieges before, but never under these conditions. In the 7th century, it had turned back the Arab armies with the fiery weapon known as Greek fire, an invention that spat liquid flame across the sea. In the 9th and 10th centuries, it had withstood Bulgarians, Rus, and Latins alike. But now, the empire was but a husk, the once vast provinces of Asia Minor and the Balkans lost. Constantinople stood as a solitary island, its survival tied to a fading memory of Rome. The Ottomans pressed relentlessly. Mehmed ordered trenches dug and towers raised, creeping closer to the walls each day. Siege engines launched stones that shattered houses within the city, while the Great Bombard continued its thunderous work. Entire sections of the outer wall collapsed in heaps of rubble, leaving yawning gaps that had to be filled with earth, timber, and anything the defenders could salvage. Children carried baskets of stones while priests blessed them in the dust. The city had become a single organism, every man, woman, and child working to keep the walls standing. Yet Constantinople had its own advantages. The chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn prevented Ottoman ships from sailing into the harbor. Behind it, Byzantine and Genoese vessels guarded the waters, firing arrows and bolts at any attempt to breach the barrier. One night, the defenders set fire to Ottoman galleys, the flames painting the water with streaks of red and gold. For a moment, the city cheered, believing the old spirit had returned. But Mehmed was no ordinary commander. He had studied ancient Roman texts, learned from engineers, and thought like a man of both old and new ages. If he could not break the chain, he would outmaneuver it. In a feat that stunned even his enemies, he ordered his men to drag ships overland. With greased logs laid across the hills of Galata, dozens of Ottoman vessels were hauled by manpower and oxen, rolling through the night like phantoms. When dawn came, the defenders awoke to see Turkish ships already floating inside the Golden Horn, behind their chain. Panic rippled through the city. The sea, which had always been their refuge, was no longer safe. The emperor's council debated with growing desperation. Constantine V knew reinforcements from the west were unlikely. Appeals to Venice and the papacy had brought only small contingents, mercenaries motivated by pay more than loyalty. Rumors spread that a great crusade might yet be called. But no armies marched. Europe was fractured. France and England still licking wounds from the 100 Years' War. Hungary and Poland locked in their own struggles, the German princes divided by rivalries. To many in the West, Constantinople was a distant dream, not a cause worth dying for. Inside the walls, supplies dwindled. Bread grew scarce, prices soared, and hunger gnawed at the poor. Yet faith remained. On the eve of great assaults, processions carried holy relics along the battlements, banners of saints fluttering in the wind. Priests preached that the Virgin herself would protect the city, as she had in centuries past. The people sang hymns even as cannon fire shook the earth, their voices defying the roar of gunpowder. By late May, the siege reached a fever pitch. For weeks, the Ottomans had tested the walls, probing for weakness, and now Mehmed prepared for the final blow. The defenders braced themselves, patching breaches, sharpening swords, whispering prayers. Constantine himself refused to abandon his post, telling his men that he would die with his city rather than live without it. The weight of history pressed down upon him, but he stood unbending, a last emperor at the gates of destiny. The night before the assault, Constantinople was a city caught between worlds. Torches burned along the walls. Bells rang from Hagia Sophia, calling the faithful to one final service. The emperor and nobles knelt beside common soldiers, all receiving communion together, the ancient ritual binding them as one. Beyond the walls, the Ottomans prepared in silence, their campfires stretching to the horizon, their drums echoing like a heartbeat of fate. The stage was set. The city of Constantine, the last Rome, stood on the brink. The air itself seemed to freeze, heavy with expectation. When the next dawn came, it would bring with it not just battle, but the decision of centuries. In the heart of Constantinople, Emperor Constantine le Palaiologos stood upon the battlements, his cloak fluttering in the spring wind. His armor gleamed faintly in the torchlight, though it was worn, patched, and polished many times over. He was not a monarch of vast dominions, but of a single city clinging to survival. And yet, in that hour, he carried the mantle of all Rome upon his shoulders. To his people, he was not merely an emperor, he was the last guardian of a civilization that stretched back 1,000 years. Constantine was no stranger to hardship. He had fought in the Peloponnesus, had seen the empire eroded province by province, and now knew that the world expected him to fall. But he was also a man of iron will. In his council chambers, he spoke with measured calm, reminding his generals, Venetian captains, and Genoese mercenaries that their cause was larger than survival. "We fight," he declared, "for the city, for the empire, and for the faith of Christendom itself." Those words echoed in vaulted halls where once Justinian had plotted his conquests, and though his resources were meager, his determination was boundless. Across the plain, the young Sultan Mehmed prepared with equal fervor. At only 21, he was driven by a vision far beyond his years. He dreamed of an empire uniting East and West, of Constantinople as his imperial seat, of a new Rome crowned beneath the crescent moon. His engineers worked tirelessly, adjusting the massive cannons, positioning siege towers, and readying ladders for the assault to come. He walked among his soldiers, speaking with them not as a distant sovereign, but as a commander who shared their fate. His charisma was electric, binding the massive host to his will. Mehmed's strategy was patient but relentless. He had studied ancient sieges, learned from his advisors, and sought not only to batter the walls, but to break the spirit within. His greatest gamble, the hauling of ships across land into the Golden Horn, had already shocked the defenders, proving that no barrier was safe. Now he would bring every resource to bear for the final assault. The cannons thundered day and night, shaking foundations, collapsing towers, filling the air with smoke and stone dust. Each blast was like the tolling of a funeral bell, marking the slow death of the city. Inside Constantinople, the defenders prepared with desperate courage. Giustiniani Longo, the Genoese captain who had brought his soldiers to aid the emperor, organized defenses with military precision. Men took their posts at the crumbling sections. Women carried water and supplies. Children fetched stones to patch the walls. Every soul became part of the defense. Priests carried icons of saints along the ramparts, blessing the soldiers as arrows whistled overhead. Hymns rose into the night, mingling with the crack of gunpowder, creating a soundscape of both faith and fury. Still, there was no illusion. The city was isolated, the enemy vast, and no great rescue fleet sailed from the west. Some whispered of treachery, others of miracles, but Constantine stood firm. He gathered his commanders one final time. Reports spoke of breaches too wide to mend, of towers ready to collapse, of morale stretched to the breaking point. Yet the emperor did not waver. He told them plainly, "The city is entrusted to us by God. I will not leave it. If it falls, I will die within its walls." Those who heard him knew they were following not merely a sovereign, but a man who had already chosen martyrdom. On the Ottoman side, Mehmed too prepared for destiny. He had promised his men the wealth of the greatest city in the world, but more than that, he promised them immortality in the pages of history. His banners fluttered in the night, the crescent gleaming against the stars. His commanders urged patience, but the young sultan was restless. He wanted the city now, to seize the glory with his own hands. He ordered prayers in the mosques of his camp, the chanting of verses rising like thunder against the walls. The world, he believed, was watching. As May 28th turned to night, the atmosphere was electric. Inside Constantinople, the last Christian liturgy was held in Hagia Sophia. Citizens, nobles, soldiers, even the emperor himself knelt together in the flickering candlelight. The vast dome glowed with a golden aura, mosaics shimmering as hymns echoed upward. Outside, in the Ottoman camp, bonfires blazed, drums pounded, and the air shook with chants of warriors ready for dawn. Two worlds faced each other across a narrow stretch of earth, both convinced that destiny was theirs. History tells us what happened when the sun rose on May 29, 1453. The cannons roared, the walls gave way, and the Ottomans poured into the city. The last emperor fought until he was cut down, and with him, Byzantium ended. 1,000 years of Roman continuity vanished in a single day. But what if it hadn't? What if the walls had held just a little longer? If the defenders had thrown back the assault? If Constantine had lived to rule another day? What if the Byzantine Empire never fell? Dawn broke over Constantinople on May 29, 1453. History records that the Great Bombard shattered the walls, that Ottoman soldiers surged through breaches, and that the purple banner of Byzantium fell forever. But let us imagine another sunrise. The smoke still hangs in the air, the cannons still thunder, but this time the walls hold. The defenders, driven by desperation and faith, repel wave after wave of attackers. Giustiniani's Genoese men fight like lions, and Constantine himself rides along the battlements, sword raised, a figure of defiance against impossible odds. In this alternate dawn, Mehmed orders his final massive assault. Janissaries storm the breaches, their disciplined ranks pushing against Byzantine shields. Arrows fall like rain, drums beat like thunder. But the defenders stand firm. Greek fire erupts from the walls in a sudden burst of flame, engulfing wooden towers and sending attackers screaming into the moat. A lucky shot from the defenders' smaller cannons strikes near the Ottoman bombard, silencing it in a cloud of shattered iron. The tide begins to turn. Hours drag into eternity. Mehmed, watching from his command post, grows impatient. His commanders urge him to withdraw, to regroup for another day. Losses mount into the thousands, the moat filling with corpses. And then a rumor spreads. A counterattack has broken through at one of the Ottoman trenches, Byzantine and Genoese soldiers cutting down exhausted Turks and setting fire to siege works. Smoke rises behind the Ottoman lines. Panic spreads. For the first time, Mehmed's men falter. In this version of history, the unthinkable happens. The Ottoman assault collapses. Soldiers retreat in disorder, janissaries dragged back by their commanders, ladders abandoned, siege engines burning. The battered walls of Constantinople still stand, blackened but unbroken. The defenders, bloodied and exhausted, raise their swords in triumph. The bells of Hagia Sophia ring out, a sound that had not been heard with such joy in centuries. The city has survived. Mehmed, furious and humiliated, withdraws his army. His dream of Rome reborn beneath the crescent is postponed, perhaps forever. The loss damages his prestige, and whispers spread across Anatolia and the Balkans. Perhaps the young sultan is not invincible after all. Rivals and vassals take note. In the courts of Europe, news of the miraculous survival spreads like wildfire. Princes who had ignored Constantinople now see opportunity. The Pope in Rome proclaims the victory a sign of divine will, urging Christendom to rally at last in a renewed crusade. Inside the city, Constantine VII is hailed as the savior emperor, the man who defied destiny. His survival breathes new life into the Byzantine dream. The empire is still small, its resources still fragile, but now it possesses something more powerful than armies: legitimacy. The world had expected Constantinople to fall. Instead, it endured. That endurance gives it leverage. Venice and Genoa, seeing trade routes preserved, pledge greater support. Hungary and Poland, emboldened by Ottoman failure, prepare campaigns against the Turks in the Balkans. Even rival kings in France and England send envoys, eager to be seen as defenders of Christendom. The Byzantine Empire, for the first time in generations, is no longer a dying ember, but a flame rekindled. Yet survival brings new challenges. How can Constantine secure his city against the next Ottoman attempt? Can he rebuild an empire from the ashes, or will he remain only the ruler of a fortress surrounded by enemies? The fate of Europe itself hangs in the balance, for with Constantinople alive, the map of the future will not unfold as we know it. This is the turning point. History has been altered. The fall that ended the Middle Ages is delayed, perhaps averted entirely. The question is no longer whether Byzantium will die, but what new world it might create if it lives. The smoke of battle still clung to the air above Constantinople, hanging like a shroud over the Golden Horn. For days, the city trembled in exhaustion, every street echoing with prayers of thanksgiving and the cries of the wounded. Constantine XI, who had expected to meet death on the walls, now walked alive among his people, hailed as a new Constantine the Great. Priests proclaimed the survival of the empire a miracle, and the faithful filled Hagia Sophia until its vast dome rang with chants of triumph. Yet beneath the joy lay a harder truth. The empire had survived, but only just. Beyond the walls, Mehmed's retreat turned into a scandal. His mighty host, bloodied and defeated, limped back across Anatolia. The great bombard lay shattered, siege towers burned, trenches abandoned. Tales of disaster spread swiftly. Vassals in the Balkans, once cowed, began to question their loyalty. The princes of Wallachia and Serbia whispered rebellion. In Anatolia itself, rival claimants to the Ottoman throne stirred, sensing weakness in the young sultan. For Mehmed, the defeat was not only military, it was personal. His dream of a new Rome had slipped from his grasp, and with it, the aura of inevitability that surrounded his rule. In Europe, the shock was electric. When messengers arrived in Venice and Rome with news that Constantinople still stood, few believed it at first. But when ships bearing wounded Genoese mercenaries entered Italian harbors, the truth could not be denied. The impossible had happened. Suddenly, the map of Christendom was alive with possibility. The Pope declared it a sign from heaven and renewed calls for a crusade. Venice, eager to secure its trade routes in the east, promised ships and soldiers. Hungary, emboldened by Ottoman weakness, prepared to strike into the Balkans. For the first time in decades, the tide seemed to shift against the crescent. Within Constantinople, Constantine Ian moved quickly. He knew the victory was fragile, that Mehmed would one day return with greater force. But now he had leverage. Envoys from across Europe filled his court, offering alliances and aid. The emperor played his role with skill, presenting himself as both the guardian of Rome's legacy and the bulwark of Christendom. His words carried weight, for he had not merely ruled. He had fought on the walls, side by side with his soldiers, and survived. Legends already painted him as a warrior king chosen by God. Still, The challenges were immense. The city's population was small, its treasury thin, and its lands few. Constantine began rebuilding the walls, repairing towers, reforging weapons. He negotiated with Venice and Genoa for supplies of gunpowder and cannon, determined that the next siege would find his city better prepared. He also turned his gaze outward. If Byzantium was to live, it could not remain a single city-state. It had to expand. In the Balkans, opportunity beckoned. Ottoman garrisons, shaken by their sultan's defeat, found themselves harassed by local rebels. Constantine sent envoys to Wallachia and Serbia, urging a united front. Skanderbeg of Albania, already a thorn in the side of the Ottomans, welcomed the chance to ally with the surviving Byzantium. Together, they envisioned a coalition that might drive the Turks from Europe entirely. But Mehmed was not idle. Humiliated though he was, the young sultan's will was iron. In his court at Edirne, he vowed to return stronger, to erase the shame of failure. He tightened his grip on Anatolia, executing rivals and crushing dissent. He ordered new foundries for cannons, larger and more durable than those lost. He studied the mistakes of the siege, swearing never to repeat them. Though the empire wavered, his ambition did not die. Constantinople remained his obsession, a wound to his pride that could only be healed by conquest. Thus the stage was set for a greater storm. Byzantium, reborn from ashes, rallied allies and rebuilt its defenses. Europe, galvanized by the miracle, prepared for crusade. And in Anatolia, the Ottomans licked their wounds but sharpened their blades for vengeance. The Mediterranean trembled, for the balance of power was shifting in ways no one had foreseen. The city that should have fallen had instead endured. Its survival sent shockwaves across continents, setting into motion a chain of events that would redraw the destiny of empires. But survival was only the beginning. The next battles would determine whether this resurrection of Byzantium was a fleeting miracle or the foundation of a new world order. The Balkans erupted like a powder keg. Word of Mehmed's failure spread faster than any army could march, carried by merchants, deserters, and priests who hailed the miracle of Constantinople. In villages along the Danube, church bells rang defiantly. In the mountains of Albania, Skanderbeg raised his banner higher, proclaiming that the Ottoman tide could be pushed back. In Serbia and Wallachia, rebel bands struck Ottoman garrisons, melting into forests before the Turks could respond. Everywhere, the myth of Ottoman invincibility cracked, and from those cracks poured rebellion. Constantine X seized the moment. Though his forces were still small, he dispatched envoys to rally this sudden wave of defiance. Promises were made in gilded halls of Venice and Rome, and sealed with toasts in the smoky camps of Balkan warlords. A coalition began to form, not a vast crusade like in the days of the First Crusaders, but a patchwork alliance of kings, dukes, mercenaries, and rebels, all bound by a common enemy. The emperor, who months earlier had commanded only a dying city, now found himself at the heart of a movement that stretched across half of Europe. The first blows fell in the spring of 1454. Hungarian armies pushed south, clashing with Ottoman cavalry on the plains. Venetian fleets struck Ottoman supply lines in the Aegean, their galleys darting through narrow straits, setting fire to coastal forts. Byzantine troops, bolstered by Italian mercenaries, marched into Thrace, recapturing towns that had not seen the imperial banner in decades. In Constantinople, crowds wept with joy as returning soldiers carried the double-headed eagle through the gates once more. But victory came at a cost. The Ottomans, though shaken, were far from broken. Mehmed rallied his janissaries and unleashed them in brutal counterattacks. Villages suspected of aiding rebels were burned, their people enslaved. Skanderbeg's Albanians fought a desperate campaign in the mountains, their victories bought with blood at every pass. The Hungarians, despite initial success, suffered a crushing defeat on the plains of Kosovo, where Ottoman cavalry encircled their knights and cut them down in a storm of arrows and sabers. The Balkans became a chessboard soaked in blood, with neither side holding the advantage for long. On the seas, the struggle was equally fierce. Venetian galleys clashed with Ottoman fleets near Gallipoli. the water churning with wreckage and fire. Genoese captains, bound by uneasy treaties, fought alongside their rivals, desperate to keep the straits open for Christian trade. The Byzantines, though lacking great numbers of ships, contributed their secret weapon, remnants of the ancient Greek fire. When unleashed against Ottoman vessels, the fiery liquid sent ships into flames so intense that survivors swore the sea itself had caught fire. The psychological terror of this weapon bought the Byzantines more respect than their small navy might otherwise command. As campaigns dragged into years, Europe itself began to transform. The survival of Constantinople meant that scholars, merchants, and priests still streamed into the city, carrying ideas and goods between east and west. The city's libraries remained intact, its scholars preserving ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost. For the first time in centuries, Byzantium once again served as a crossroads, not of empires, but of cultures, of armies, of destinies colliding. Yet for Constantine VII, the burden only grew heavier. Each victory demanded more men, more gold, more promises to allies who often valued profit above faith. He aged quickly, his beard turning white, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights spent balancing the fragile coalition. Still, he pressed forward, convinced that God had spared his empire for a purpose greater than survival. And across the straits, Mehmed sharpened his resolve. The humiliation of 1453 burned like a brand in his soul. Each campaign, whether victory or defeat, he saw only as steps toward redemption. He built new cannons, larger still, ordered fortresses raised along the Bosphorus to choke Constantinople's lifelines, and swore that he would return to the city that had denied him glory. For Mehmed, the war was not over. It had merely entered its next act. By the late 1450s, the eastern Mediterranean was ablaze. Battles raged on land and sea, alliances formed and broke, and both Byzantium and the Ottomans bled. Yet the most important fact remained unchanged. Constantinople still stood. The city that should have fallen had instead become the spark of a wider conflagration. And as fires spread across the Balkans, the question was no longer whether Byzantium could survive, but whether its survival would reshape the destiny of the entire world. The 1460s opened like a storm over the Balkans. A decade of relentless war had drained both Byzantium and the Ottomans, yet neither side could yield. The survival of Constantinople had transformed the conflict from a siege into a struggle for supremacy. Every valley echoed with the tramp of soldiers, every port bustled with fleets arming for battle. The fate of empires now hung upon a knife's edge. Constantine V, aged yet unbroken, threw the weight of his authority behind a bold plan to push the frontier outward and secure a defensive belt of fortresses in Thrace and Macedonia. With Venetian gold and Genoese engineers, he rebuilt walls and constructed new bastions along river crossings. Small Byzantine armies, reinforced by Balkan allies, struck Ottoman garrisons in lightning raids, toppling outposts and liberating villages long accustomed to foreign tribute. For the first time in living memory, the imperial eagle flew beyond the immediate shadow of Constantinople's walls. But Mehmed was no passive foe. His humiliation in 1453 had hardened into an obsession. He reorganized his armies with ruthless efficiency, tightening janissary discipline and importing foreign engineers to craft ever deadlier artillery. He struck back with calculated fury, descending upon Serbia and Wallachia in campaigns that left fields littered with corpses and castles reduced to rubble. His strategy was clear. If he could not yet take Constantinople, he would bleed its allies until the city stood alone once more. Espionage became as critical as the sword. Venetian merchants, ever pragmatic, played both sides, selling weapons in Constantinople while secretly negotiating trade privileges with the Ottomans. In the courts of Europe, ambassadors whispered of betrayal, of nobles bribed to withhold troops, of mercenaries ready to switch allegiance mid-battle. The struggle was no longer fought only on the walls, but in shadows, in council chambers, in the clinking of coins exchanged in the dark. In 1462, the war reached a fever pitch. Vlad III of Wallachia, known to history as Vlad the Impaler, entered the fray with his infamous tactics of terror. Aligning with Constantine's coalition, he launched night raids into Ottoman camps, impaling prisoners on stakes to strike fear into the hearts of Mehmed's soldiers. The brutality shocked even hardened warriors, but it achieved its purpose. Ottoman advance in the region slowed, their morale shaken. Constantine seized the chance, pushing imperial banners deeper into Thrace, reclaiming towns thought lost forever. Yet victory was fleeting. Mehmed responded with overwhelming force, leading a vast army northward. The two sides clashed in a series of brutal battles near the Danube, fields drenched with blood, neither side able to claim decisive triumph. But the psychological stakes were immense. If the Ottomans broke Wallachia and Serbia, Byzantium's fragile alliance would collapse. If Constantine held them together, a new order in the Balkans might emerge. Meanwhile, the Mediterranean seethed with conflict. Venetian and Ottoman fleets clashed near the Dardanelles, where fireships lit the night sky with infernos that turned the sea into a graveyard. Byzantine captains, wielding fragments of Greek fire, became legends, their small ships destroying larger Ottoman galleys in blazes that terrified all who witnessed them. Control of the sea was never absolute, shifting from month to month, yet it ensured that Constantinople remained supplied and connected to the wider Christian world. Inside the city, Constantine bore the strain of endless war. His hair had turned white, his hands trembled with age, but his resolve remained unshaken. Chroniclers recorded his nightly walks along the rebuilt Theodosian walls, touching the stones as if communing with the empire's spirit. To his people, he had become more than emperor. He was a living saint, the man who had defied death itself to keep the empire alive. Pilgrims flocked to Constantinople, bringing alms and relics, as if the city itself had become a shrine of survival. And yet, for all the victories and miracles, danger lurked. The coalition of allies was fragile, bound by necessity rather than loyalty. Venice eyed the trade routes more hungrily than the fate of Christendom. Hungary feared the growing prestige of Byzantium almost as much as the Turks. Even among the emperor's advisors, factions whispered, should the empire seek union with Rome, accepting papal supremacy, or remain defiantly orthodox, risking Western abandonment? Every decision threatened to fracture the unity that had preserved Constantinople thus far. By the late 1460s, both empires stood bloodied but unbroken. The Ottomans retained their vast manpower and wealth, their sultans still young and unrelenting. Byzantium, though still small, wielded influence far beyond its borders, a beacon of resistance that kept Europe engaged in the East. The war had become more than a struggle for land. It was a battle for destiny, for whether the old Rome of the East would finally rise again, or whether Mehmed would yet fulfill his dream of conquest. As armies gathered once more on the plains of Thrace, with banners snapping in the wind and cannons dragged into place, the world braced for a clash that might decide the fate of not just Byzantium or the Ottomans, but of Europe itself. The stage was set for a reckoning greater than any siege, a storm that would determine whose empire would inherit the future. By the dawn of the 1470s, the Byzantine Empire, thought long dead, still stood defiant. Against every expectation, its purple banners fluttered from the towers of Constantinople, and its emperor still held court beneath the golden dome of Hagia Sophia. Yet, the survival of Byzantium did more than prolong a war. It reshaped the very currents of history. The Renaissance, already stirring in Italy, found new fuel from a Constantinople that had not fallen. Scholars who might have fled westward with manuscripts now remained in the city, teaching in Greek, Latin, and even Arabic. The libraries of Constantinople, repositories of ancient wisdom, remained intact. Works of Plato and Aristotle, mathematical treatises from Alexandria, maps drawn by forgotten geographers, and medical texts copied since the days of Galen, all survived, not as scattered fragments, but as a living intellectual tradition. Pilgrims, merchants, and students from across Europe came to study in the empire's schools. The city once again became a bridge between worlds, where knowledge flowed as freely as spices and silk. Culturally, Byzantium's endurance emboldened orthodoxy. No longer a dwindling faith pressed beneath Ottoman conquest, it stood as a proud counterpart to Latin Christendom. The Patriarch of Constantinople, spared exile, wielded influence not only over Greeks, but also over Slavs in Serbia, Bulgaria, and Russia. Moscow, which had begun to see itself as the Third Rome after Constantinople's fall in real history, now found its role complicated. Would it rise in rivalry to the restored empire, or in alliance? The answer would shape the destiny of Eastern Europe for centuries. Economically, the survival of Constantinople preserved crucial trade routes. Venetian merchants, secure in their eastern gateway, continued to funnel spices and silks into Europe, slowing the push for Atlantic exploration. Without the shock of 1453 to severe trade, perhaps Columbus would never have sailed west in desperation for a new route to Asia. Perhaps the Americas would remain untouched by Europe for decades more, their fate delayed by the endurance of a single city. Politically, Byzantium's resurgence forced Europe to reconsider its balance of power. Hungary, Poland, and Venice, once dominant in Balkan affairs, now found themselves negotiating with an emperor who commanded not just symbolism, but real armies. France and England, recovering from the Hundred Years' War, eyed the Eastern conflict with both opportunity and suspicion. Even the papacy, eager to harness Constantinople's survival as proof of divine favor, struggled with the empire's orthodox independence. Should Byzantium bow to Rome or remain defiantly separate? Constantine walked a careful line, using both faith and politics as weapons as sharp as swords. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire reeled but endured. Mehmed's prestige had been wounded, yet his ambition burned hotter than ever. He poured resources into reforming his armies, centralizing power, and crushing dissent in Anatolia. Though beaten at Constantinople, he expanded elsewhere, securing territory in Asia, fortifying his hold over Muslim lands, and presenting himself as champion of Islam against the Christian coalition. His empire became more militarized, more disciplined, forged in the crucible of failure. The clash of civilizations that in our history had seemed decided in 1453 now stretched into a generational struggle. Children were born in Constantinople who had never known Ottoman victory, who grew up believing their city was unbreakable. Songs were sung of Constantine the Savior, legends whispered of angels seen upon the battlements during the siege, stories that turned the city into something more than stone and mortar. It became myth, living myth, as powerful as Rome itself once had been. And yet, beneath the triumph, shadows lingered. The empire remained small, its resources fragile. Its survival depended not only on victories, but on alliances. And alliances were fickle. Venice hungered for monopoly, Hungary for territory, the papacy for submission. Constantine's successors would inherit not only a city, but also a labyrinth of promises and debts. To survive one siege was miraculous. To endure centuries more would demand more than miracles. It would demand statesmanship, cunning, and perhaps ruthless choices that might stain the very glory they had fought to preserve. By the close of the decade, both Byzantium and the Ottomans had bled, yet both still stood. The war had transformed from a single siege into a clash of destinies, each empire refusing to die, each determined to shape the world in its image. Constantinople glowed at night with the light of 1,000 torches, as if the city itself proclaimed, "Rome still lives." But beyond the horizon, Mehmed sharpened his blade once more, preparing to prove that destiny could be delayed, but never denied. By the dawn of the 16th century, Europe and the Near East bore little resemblance to the world we know. The survival of Constantinople had turned a single siege into a century of struggle, a war of wills that reshaped empires and redirected the course of nations. Where history once declared the Ottomans triumphant, here they remained locked in a stalemate, their power immense yet forever checked by the city they had failed to take. In this altered world, Byzantium had not reclaimed the sweeping dominions of Justinian, but it had carved out a new role, guardian of the frontier. Its emperors, successors of Constantine the Theouanus, forged alliances not through grandeur, but through necessity. They ruled not an empire of vast provinces, but a confederation of loyal cities and fortresses across Thrace, Macedonia, and the Aegean Islands. The purple banners still flew, but now beside them fluttered the lions of Venice, the crosses of Hungarian knights, and the sigils of Balkan princes. The empire survived by weaving itself into a larger tapestry, one thread among many, but a thread of gold all the same. This survival created ripples across Europe. Without the fall of Constantinople, the panic that once drove explorers westward did not ignite in the same way. Columbus still dreamed of new worlds, but his voyage was delayed, his patrons hesitant. The great flood of conquest and colonization that would reshape the globe in our history arrived more slowly, perhaps a generation or more late. Instead, European energies remained fixed upon the East, upon the eternal clash between Christendom and the Sultanate across the Bosphorus. The Renaissance deepened, its roots nourished by a Constantinople still teeming with scholars and manuscripts. The scientific revolution may even have quickened, with the ancient texts of Greece preserved in fuller form. Their wisdom spread earlier across Europe's universities. For the Ottomans, the consequences were profound. Mehmed's successors inherited not an aura of inevitability, but a legacy of frustration. The empire remained vast and powerful, stretching deep into Anatolia and the Levant. But its European advance was forever contested. Each campaign northward met resistance from a coalition galvanized by the beacon of Byzantium. Each attempt to retake Constantinople ended not in triumph, but in bitter stalemate. The Ottoman dream of a capital that spanned 2 continents remained just that, a dream. Instead, they turned inward, consolidating Anatolia, expanding into the Arab lands, but forever haunted by the city that stood between them and Europe's heart. Culturally, the Orthodox world flourished in ways unfamiliar to us. With Constantinople intact, Moscow never fully claimed the mantle of the Third Rome. Russian princes still expanded, but without the symbolic void left by the city's fall, their ambitions unfolded differently, slower, less absolute. The Slavic world looked southward for guidance, to the golden dome of Hagia Sophia rather than the rising spires of Moscow. This altered allegiance may have tempered the emergence of Russian autocracy, or redirected it into alliances rather than dominions. Yet Byzantium's endurance was no idol. Survival demanded sacrifices. The emperors of this reborn empire often bent to Venetian bankers, traded privileges to Genoese merchants, and submitted to papal demands for aid. Orthodoxy endured, but always under pressure to reconcile with Rome. The city remained magnificent, its mosaics glowing by candlelight, but its independence was constantly bartered in fragments of sovereignty. The miracle of survival had bound the empire to a perpetual struggle, one that preserved it but also chained it. And still, the symbolic power of Byzantium could not be denied. In courts from Paris to Krakow, ambassadors marveled at the sight of an emperor crowned in the tradition of Constantine, a living bridge between ancient Rome and the modern age. For common folk across Christendom, the tale of the city that defied destiny became legend, sung by bards, painted in frescoes, invoked in sermons. Constantinople was no longer merely a capital. It was an idea, the idea that civilizations might endure against all odds. By the year 1500, the world teetered on the brink of modernity. Gunpowder empires rose, printing presses spread knowledge, and the age of discovery flickered just beyond the horizon. But here, in this alternate timeline, one constant remained. The golden dome of Hagia Sophia still stood above the Bosphorus, its bells tolling, its emperor enthroned. Rome, in the east, had never fallen. And that single fact bent the arc of history itself. But what would it mean for the centuries to follow? Would a surviving Byzantium guide Europe into a brighter age of unity? Or would its fragile alliances collapse, dragging the continent into endless wars? The answer lay not in destiny, but in choices yet to be made. The centuries turned, and the world reshaped itself around a truth that should never have been. The Byzantine Empire endured. Hagia Sophia's dome never fell silent. Its bells tolled through the Reformation, through the rise of gunpowder kingdoms, through the dawning age of global empires. Constantinople, instead of becoming Istanbul, remained a capital of living Rome, scarred, diminished, yet indomitable. In this alternate reality, maps looked different. The Ottoman Empire never reached the gates of Vienna, never stood as the terror of Central Europe. Its expansion was redirected south and east, deeper into the Arab lands, where its energies consumed themselves in deserts and holy cities rather than in Europe's fertile plains. The great clash that defined our timeline, the long struggle between Habsburg and Ottoman, between Vienna and the Sublime Porte, never burned as brightly. Instead, the frontier war smoldered around Thrace, Macedonia, and the Aegean, an eternal borderland where Christendom and Islam met in grinding stalemate. Byzantium itself did not return to its ancient grandeur. It did not conquer Egypt or Spain, nor reclaim the vast sweep of Justinian's dream. But it became something else, something equally transformative. It became a shield that absorbed Ottoman ambition, that gave Europe space to breathe, to argue, to invent. With Constantinople intact, scholars and merchants continued to cross the Bosphorus as they had for centuries, binding East and West together. Ancient texts, preserved in the empire's libraries, circulated more widely and earlier, accelerating the Renaissance and giving birth to new sciences decades ahead of schedule. The printing press found fertile ground in a city still alive with intellectual ferment. Ideas of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy that in our world arrived in dribs and drabs poured forth in a torrent, fueling revolutions of thought across the continent. And yet, survival came with its paradox. Byzantium's emperors, clinging to power in a fragile confederation of allies, constantly bartered sovereignty for security. Venice, Genoa, Hungary, even the papacy, they all pulled at the empire, extracting privileges, demanding concessions. The Byzantines, masters once of half the known world, lived on by weaving compromises. Their empire was not a colossus, but a mosaic, glorious to behold, yet fragile to the touch. For the Orthodox world, the survival of Constantinople meant a different destiny. Moscow, deprived of its claim as the Third Rome, developed in other directions, its imperial ideology muted or delayed. The Slavic lands looked southward, to the city on the Bosphorus, rather than to the northern forests. A different spiritual gravity reshaped the East, altering the balance of faith and politics in ways our history never knew. For the New World, the effects were equally profound. With trade routes to Asia intact, the desperation that pushed Columbus westward came later. Perhaps the Americas were not claimed by Spain in 1492. Perhaps they were touched by Europe only decades afterward, with Portugal or Venice at the helm. Entire civilizations across the Atlantic might have lived longer, altered, or even endured in forms unrecognizable to us. A single city's survival delayed the collision of worlds. And what of the Ottomans? In this timeline, they remained mighty but unfulfilled. They conquered lands, yes, but never the city they desired most. Constantinople's walls denied them their ultimate triumph, and that denial reshaped their legacy. The sultans who in our world became emperors of two continents were here reduced to monarchs of Anatolia and the Levant, powerful but forever haunted by the shadow of the city they could not claim. Mehmed's dream of a new Rome was never realized, and in that void, the Byzantines carved out their unlikely second life. So we are left with a question. What would it mean to live in such a world? A Europe where Byzantium was not memory but reality. A Renaissance accelerated, an Ottoman Empire checked, and America's left waiting just a little longer for its fate. Would such a world be brighter, knowledge deeper, faith stronger, wars fewer? Or would it be darker, locked in an endless frontier struggle that drained generations of blood, preventing the great voyages and revolutions that shaped our own time? History is a chain, and every link binds us to the next. In our world, one link was broken on May 29, 1453, And the fall of Constantinople marked the end of an age, but in this story, that link held, and the chain of Rome stretched onward into centuries unknown. So we leave you with this thought. Would you want to live in that world? A world where the last empire of Rome still stood, where Hagia Sophia's dome never fell silent, where East and West were bound by a city that refused to die? Or is our own world, born of that fall, inevitable, and perhaps even necessary? What do you think, after seeing this vision of history reborn? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into an alternate past, don't forget to like and share, so that more can hear the echo of the empire that, in another world, never fell.